What makes a vintage snare drum so desirable? Well, in this Snare Saturday video, we're going to be talking about snare drum tone and comparing vintage snare drums to modern snare drums. We're going to uncover the secrets behind their unique sounds to see which one best fits your needs. For those who might be unfamiliar with the channel, hello and welcome. My name is Costa and I am a drummer from Philly, PA. And this video is going to be talking about vintage and modern snare drums to see if vintage snare drums really are super desirable and that you need one in your collection. Now, before we dive into this video, make sure you hit the subscribe button as well as the bell icon. That way you're notified of any additional content that I upload to the channel. Let's get started with how the modern day drum set came about and the evolution of the snare drum. In Western civilization, percussion instruments were rudimental, and the snare drum in particular was used for things like being on the front line of an army as a form of communication. Fast forward to the early 1900s, and jazz out of New Orleans was starting to become more and more prominent. Because of this, early adaptations of what is now known as the drum set started to come about as well. Now, snare drums started out just like other drums were starting out. They were rope tension. Then over time, rather than using rope tension, companies were starting to use T-rods that would adjust the tension of both the top and bottom head simultaneously. And then finally, companies were starting to use a tubular lug or a single post lug in the middle of the drum in order to adjust the tension of both the top and the bottom head. Then between the 1920s and 30s, we're starting to see new lug designs that replicate the lugs that we see today. And it wasn't until 1939 when William Gladstone came up with a patent that allowed you to independently tune the top and bottom head separate from one another. Along with the advancements of tension and hardware used on the drums like I just mentioned, there were also advancements with the drumhead selection and snare wires. The original drumheads were made out of animal skins, and snare wires were made out of guts.
Is that metal?
I hate to say it, but
Yeah, not to be contradictory, but it's very metal.
I guess I didn't know all that stuff was metal.
Now, drumheads in particular, when they were made out of animal skin, climate and weather really affected the way that they sounded, causing them to get super tight or stretch out and get really loose just based on the environment that they were in. And me personally, I've never experienced snare wires made out of actual guts, but I'm pretty sure the same effect occurred. Then in the 1950s, Remo Belli and Samuel Mushnick developed the first drumhead made out of Mylar, aka plastic. This creation of Mylar drumheads allowed drummers to have a drumhead that was more durable, had a broader tuning range, and wasn't affected by the weather as much as an animal skin drumhead. Hence why Remos are known as Weather King drumheads. And of course, transitioning snare wires from the guts of an animal to a metal wire also provided more durability and resistance from weather. Now, by the time that the Mylar head was invented in the 1950s, you are starting to see drums made out of both wood and metal. Now, wood snare drums of this time were usually a 3-ply configuration, an inside and outside ply consisting of maple or mahogany wood, and then a really thick poplar core. In order to make sure that the drum stayed in round, re-rings were applied to the top and bottom portions of the shell, which for the most part were made out of maple. Not only did the re-rings allow the drum to stay in round more than not having re-rings, it also provided more surface area to create a bearing edge. And these vintage drums had a broader bearing edge on them than a modern day drum, meaning that more of that shell was making contact with the heads on both the top and bottom of the drum. This produced a warmer tone out of the drum rather than something that had way more attack like a modern day snare drum. Now with vintage drums, the bearing edges on the wood drums compared to the metal drums are drastically different from one another, which is also why you get that warm, direct tone out of a vintage wood drum compared to the attack and crispiness of a metal drum. Now, modern day snare drums, they're configured for the most part the same way, however, they're designed differently. If we're to talk about wood snare drums, rather than being a 3-ply configuration where the majority of the shell is made out of poplar, there's now multiple plies for a shell. And the most common configurations could be a 6-ply, 8-ply, or even a 10-ply for a snare drum. Most snare drums don't come with re-rings, however, because there's no need to keep them in round like vintage 3-ply drums. However, there are some modern day snare drums that do have re-rings installed in them as well, which once again provides more surface area for the bearing edges. Now, although metal snare drums for the most part are made the same exact way, they are going to be different based on the alloys that are used. So a Superphonic from the 60s might sound a little bit different than a Superphonic from the 70s or a present day Superphonic, just because of whatever combination they're using to make the aluminum shells for the drums aren't going to be 100% the same exact thing. Then, of course, you start diving into how many lugs are on the drum, how heavy the hoops are, even if there are gaskets behind the lugs or not, which will all factor into the sound of the drum. Speaking of hardware, modern day hardware on snare drums is a lot heavier and more durable than vintage drums. Just take hoops, for example. Triple flange hoops back then, 50s, 60s, somewhat into the 70s as well, were a 1.6 millimeter thickness. The triple flange hoops of today, the most common size is 2.3 millimeters. This is why with vintage snare drums, especially when you are looking on the used market, you will see some of the hoops are a little bit bent. Because if you have a drummer who is playing a lot of rim shots, that thinner hoop is not going to hold up as well. Also, another contributing factor, the number of lugs. Modern day snare drums for the most part come with 10 lugs, although there are some configurations out there that offer 8 lugs. Vintage drums, however, it was 2 lugs less. So most snare drums were 8 lugs, some were offered in 6. However, there are some vintage snare drums that also had 10 lugs. It just wasn't as common as they are today. This is also why a lot of folks will prefer a vintage drum over a modern drum, because the vintage model may have 8 lugs and sound a little more airy and have more breath to it, whereas the modern 10 lug snare drum is going to be more direct sounding. So now the question we've all been waiting for: which one is better? Well, there isn't an answer to this. At least I can't give you an answer to this. Only you could give an answer to this. It really all depends on what you need your snare drum for. Are you a drummer who is playing a lot of gigs on the road? Or are you a session musician who does most of their work inside a studio? Are you playing gigs where you have sound reinforcement? Or are you playing venues where there is no sound reinforcement and you need that snare drum to cut through a mix? Also, what kind of a player are you? Are you a little heavy-handed, or are you somebody who plays a bit more on the lighter side? Finally, what kind of sound are you going for? Do you want something that's a little more subdued and warmer, or do you prefer something that is going to cut through a mix? These are the questions that you have to ask yourself in order to determine if you really need that vintage snare drum or if you'll be okay with a modern snare drum. One thing to keep in mind, however, the older the drum, the more it's going to affect the sound of it. Clearly, wood is something that gets affected by climate and age. However, the same thing can be said for metal drums. Take a Black Beauty, for example. Those initial Black Beauties were 8-lug drums and they were brass shells, but they're going to sound a whole lot different than a modern day Black Beauty. One, because those vintage Black Beauties might have tube lugs on them, although Ludwig does offer the modern day Black Beauty with tube lugs. That vintage Black Beauty is going to have 8 lugs, where modern Black Beauties have 10 lugs. Although once again, they do offer a Black Beauty with 8 lugs if you wanted a modern day one with it. And then finally, the gaskets. Modern day Black Beauties have gaskets behind the lugs, whereas the vintage drums do not. And a lot of folks believe that those gaskets dampen the shell a little bit because you have a piece of rubber between the shell and the lug itself. Finally, the hoops. A thinner hoop on a vintage drum is going to make the drum more open than a 2.3 millimeter heavier hoop that's on the drum today. So now I have to ask you, if you were searching for a vintage drum, why were you searching for a vintage drum? And do you believe that you could get the sounds that you want out of a modern drum? I'd love to know, so make sure that you leave all of that in the comment section below. Now, if you have a vintage snare drum or you're saving up money to get a vintage snare drum, I'd love to know which one it is. So leave that in the comment section as well. If you would like to see some of the snare drums featured in this video in broader tuning ranges, I've put links to the older Snare Saturday videos in the description below. And if you'd like to check out the entire Snare Saturday series, I've put a link to the playlist in the description below. I'll also have it come up right here to make it a bit easier for you. Finally, if you enjoyed this video, please make sure that you give it a thumbs up. Not only does that make it easier for others to find it, it is a free and easy way to support the channel. And that is it. Thank you so much for checking out this video on vintage versus modern snare drums. Which one wins? And until next time, see you later.